Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another great day in American history. So we are going to continue on with our notes about child labor. So yesterday we took a look at child labor photos from Louis Hine, and we took a look at the impact of child labor had on individuals and found out that many children are being maimed, they're going to have respiratory problems, and they're going to, some of them in cases, actually die at work. So eventually we are going to get, because of the pressure of muckrakers and our progressive reformers, Congress to pass a law. So they're going to pass the Keating-Owens Child Labor Act of 1916, which is going to limit working hours for children. The limited hours basically are going to cut your working time down from 10 to 12 hours a day to 8 hours a day. It also is going to prohibit children from under 14 to work on interstate commerce, which basically means that if they are working and producing a product or supplying something or carrying something that eventually is going to be sold, it has to be sold in state. It cannot be cross state lines, which is going to drastically decrease the profits of business owners. So most businesses are not going to like this Keating-Owens Child Labor Act. It also is going to give workers the right to negotiate with factories and with their jobs if they're over the age of 14. And on paper, it sounds like this is a really great idea, and this is going to give all kinds of opportunities for workers to increase their wages. However, the problem is that most factories and most steel mills and coal mines are all going to be paying the same wage. And there's a very, very large labor supply at this time period. So if you don't want to work for $2 a day or you don't want to work for $5 a week, it's perfectly fine, because there's somebody else who will. So it really does not give power to the workers at all. Eventually, the Supreme Court is going to declare this law unconstitutional because, again, only states have the right to regulate child labor. Basically, again, it goes back to this idea that the government does not have the right to tell you who you can negotiate with, and if the person wants to accept a bad negotiation or a bad wage or bad working hours or bad working conditions, the person has the right to do that. Muckrakers or unions eventually are going to convince almost every state to pass individual laws, and that's how eventually the child labor laws are going to be enacted. Biggest reason they're going to take a look at this is going to be morality. Again, it is not the fact that children are getting hurt or they're getting lifetime sicknesses. It's the fact that they're not in school. Because the kids are not in school, they're not going to be able to get the education necessary to potentially become economically successful in the future. So the idea here is I send the kids to school, they're going to get a good education, and the result of that is they're going to end up helping everyone improve the economy in the future. So states start to pass compulsory school attendance laws. We also are going to start to see that compensation laws are going to be passed by individual states to help the workers out if they are injured in the job. So Maryland does pass a law that requires employees to pay benefits if someone is killed at work. Wisconsin also is going to pass a law that employers are going to be required to provide medical and wage replacement if people are injured at work. And the only key to this here is you have to remember is if you do accept any of the compensation, you do not have the right to sue in the future. So although it sounds like we're doing a lot in order to stop the abuses of workers by business, we still gave business a little bit of power here that if you do accept the benefits, that you actually cannot come back and sue them in the long run. In terms of education, again, public schools are available after the Civil War, but majority of people do not attend public schools. They're working. Again, when you have that mass movement from an agriculture to industrial society, and I get to the city and I've got my 10 kids, and I have to have all of a sudden pay for food instead of having them grow food outside, the end result of that is the kids are going to need to work. So we do start to see a gradual increase in laws that are going to require children to actually go to school. So the first laws are really just going to have schools that are going to last anywhere between 12 and 16 weeks, and they're usually going to be for children in the ages of 8 to 14. After 14, you are not going to be required to go to school at all. We also are going to start to see the inclusion of kindergartens in the public school system to help working mothers who are not going to have access to childcare. Education is going to be seen as a way to advance workers and society as a whole. Again, the Second Industrial Revolution has a lot of new products, a lot of new ideas, a lot of new stuff that's going to be made, but people do need to have technical skills and they need to have managerial skills in order to do these things and make the economy function and run. And they have to have an education to do that. So you're going to start to see that with the majority of workers leaving school at the age of 14, they don't have the skills necessary to be entrepreneurs, start businesses, or be managers. So a lot of the top business leaders are going to start to push the idea that you need to have a secondary education in order to provide the skills necessary for this new industrial world. Andrew Carnegie is going to be one of those who are going to urge businesses to provide opportunities for workers to get a higher education. What we start to see is the creation of high schools. In high schools, we're going to start to focus on science, civics, and also social studies. We also are going to see the creation of vocational schools. They're going to focus on drafting, carpentry, mechanics, and also stenography, which is basically just a version of shorthand, taking notes relatively quickly. Educational opportunities are not always going to be the same for all Americans. African Americans were not permitted to go to public schools, but you do have 2/3 of the African American children population going to private schools. One of the first private schools was going to be made by Mary McLeod Bethune, and again, she's going to create private schools for African Americans. Immigrants also are going to be encouraged to go to school in order to become Americanized. So this is a place I can learn English, I can learn culture, I can learn a skill, I can, start to get to learn about my new country that I'm in. So thousands of adults and children are going to attend schools so they can get better jobs and also hopefully qualify for citizenship. In these schools, we're going to teach English and democracy. And again, our biggest concern with some of our immigrants, in particular our new immigrants who are coming in, is concerns that they're not from a democratic country. So we have to teach them how a democracy works, how to participate inside the government. So we're going to teach them about American history and politics, culture, and again, companies are going to offer programs that if you go to these schools and if you get an education, you can start to advance inside of the company. Not everyone, however, is going to be pleased with the mandatory educational system. The educational system is going to be based on the King James Bible, which is a Protestant Bible. So I do have a lot of new immigrants who are coming from Italy who are going to be Catholic. And also I do have new immigrants coming from Ireland who are Catholic. They do not want their kids to learn about the King James Bible. So they're going to send them to parochial schools that are going to be based on a Catholic education. As the number of high school graduates are going to increase, we are going to see that people are going to further their education even more by going to universities and colleges. The curriculum is going to start to expand greatly, including modern languages, physical science, psychology, and also sociology. And again, admittance is going to be a little bit different than it is today. You do not, at that time period, had to take the ACT or the SAT. You have to just have a high school diploma or pass a different type of entrance exam. And every university have their own entrance exam. We do also have private universities and colleges that are going to be available for African Americans. They're going to be very, very small in number because these ones are going to be based entirely on private contributions, and they are going to be private institutions. So Booker T. Washington is going to found the Tuskegee University in Alabama. This is going to actually be an agricultural-based school. So how do I grow crops? What's the best way to irrigate fields? How do I get rid of bugs? How do I eventually form a small market or stand from the crops that I grow? He also is going to urge that African Americans should accept segregation if they are able to have economic and educational opportunities that eventually will lead them to equality in time. On the other side of that, we also have W.E.B. Du Bois. He's going to be educated at Harvard University, and he's going to have a totally different approach than Booker T. Washington. He believes in the Niagara movement, which is that African Americans should become educated to be leaders inside of the African American community, and eventually also should have immediate equality under the law. So they should be immediately mainstreamed into American life. The belief here is that under the Constitution, it says that all men are created equal and that all Americans are created equal, and African Americans are going to be granted citizenship by birth, and as a result of that, he believes that they should have equal status under the law. After the Civil War, African Americans do win new political and social rights during Reconstruction. A lot of people are going to believe that this is going to change the way that they live, but you do not see that in the South. A lot of the southern states are going to have a broad system of legal and legal, racial discrimination and prejudice that's going to make sure that the African American population does not have the right to vote. The biggest issue here with voting is if I include, and this happens with every single new group that gains the right to vote, if I include a large segment of the population all of a sudden into the voters, they can actually change who actually gets elected, and they can actually change policy, and they can change a lot of things that actually is occurring inside of the country. So in most cases, they try to stop any large new group from getting the right to vote. However, you do have amendments that were passed in order to guarantee some basic rights to African Americans. So the 13th Amendment is going to abolish slavery, and then the 14th Amendment is going to grant African American citizenship. In order to ensure that southern states are actually following the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment, we're going to see the Civil Rights Act is going to be passed in 1875, and that basically says that African Americans have equal access to all public facilities and all public places, and also says that if any lawsuits that are going to be heard dealing with an African American must be heard in federal court, not state or local court. Your state or local judges or municipal judges may be influenced to vote towards southern tendencies and to make sure that African Americans don't gain access to certain things. So at the federal level, they were going to just be following the laws, and hopefully they were going to see that over time they're going to be able to break down the prejudice and discrimination that was experienced in the South. However, like many of our other laws we've talked about before, the Supreme Court is going to declare this unconstitutional. Again, it goes back to the right to negotiate. Businesses and individuals have the right to practice segregation because they have the right to negotiate who they want to do business with. So African Americans' equal rights were already covered through the amendments, the 13th and 14th Amendment, and should not then be added into the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So what you start to see in the southern states is you start to see restrictions on African American voting to make it very, very difficult to actually exercise your right to vote. So you had to basically be able to do two things. The first one is pass a literacy test, and the literacy test is going to basically make sure that you're literate enough to make a sound decision about a political issue or a candidate. And then after you pass the literacy tax, you then had to pay the poll tax, which is a tax that had to be paid prior to voting. The tax is very, very expensive. Most African Americans are not going to have the means to actually pay for the tax. Now, if by chance you cannot pass the literacy test or pay for the poll tax, you then have to use a grandfather clause to determine if you have the right to vote. And the grandfather clause basically says that if I fail the literacy test and I can't pay the poll tax, it's based on if my grandfather had the right to vote. And in 1875, obviously African American grandfathers do not have the right to vote prior to that. So again, you are limiting the African Americans the right to vote in southern states. So I'm going to stop here for your notes today because on Monday, what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of an exercise in class about the literacy test. So please make sure that at this point you are going to you finished your child labor video and you've done the extension questions. If you still have time remaining in class, you can start to continue working on your immigration project, or you can continue working on the next section of homework, which is going to be Module 5, Lesson 3, and eventually that's going to actually be due on Tuesday. All right, so have a great weekend, guys, and I'll see you on Monday.